The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Ron Formisano, the William T. Bryan Chair of American History at the University of Kentucky and an expert in U.S. political culture and politics. His latest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. Ron Formisano, thanks very much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
I am happy to be here and must tell you I am now happily emeritus and working on another book.
And congratulations on both.
Thank you.
Before we talk about your latest book, Plutocracy in America, plutocracy, by simple definition, government by the wealthy. If you would, give us some examples of other societies that have been plutocratic.
Well, the word originates in two Greek words. One of them means wealth, the other means power. That's pretty self-explanatory. I mean more than ruled by the wealthy. Also, a government awash in campaign cash from lobbyists, corporations, and they have created an infrastructure of government policy that benefits a range of business interests and the wealthy. Now, in my book, I call this hydra-headed because it's not just one organized elite. It consists of many competing interests, and they try to influence government not to regulate this or to create that tax loophole. They try to get an edge even on one another. An example of earlier plutocracy is very much the late 19th century United States, with the federal and many state governments pretty much for sale to railroads, early agribusiness, industrial interests. Political scientists have written some excellent studies examining inequality and political power. They conclude that Washington responds primarily, almost exclusively, to the most affluent citizens and organized business interests. When policies favored by the middle class and low-income groups get enacted, it's usually when elite interests also support them. I don't hesitate, some political scientists do, most of them, to characterize our government as plutocratic. I qualify that by saying the United States has reached a tipping point. Nothing is ever completely homogeneous. We are more plutocratic than representative.
We've always heard from conservatives about the undeserving poor, but you document the existence of another group, the undeserving rich. Who are they, and why don't they deserve their riches?
Love to talk about them. Political scientist Leslie McCall wrote a provocative book titled The Undeserving Rich. It's fairly technical. It's known probably mostly to academics. But it's a great book. She argued two themes, that Americans do care about inequality, and Americans especially disapprove of inequality when they see the wealthy blocking opportunity. And that, of course, has been what Americans have perceived since 2008. I expand that concept of the undeserving rich beyond McCall to include business interests that depend on government handouts in the form of tax loopholes. And by the way, they are mirroring what they regard as the undeserving poor, depending on handouts. Corporations that engage in what economists call rent-seeking by holding commodities and manipulating the price. cartels that have prospered from 3 decades of deregulation, drug companies that profit from patents that make a mockery of the free market and cause America, I'm sure everybody knows Americans pay more than double what people in other advanced countries pay. And I especially include among the undeserving rich the banksters that engaged in unpunished fraud and criminal activity leading up to 2007, 2008. That doesn't exhaust the category. And I must add, of course, not all the wealthy are undeserving. Rich people are a very diverse lot. Most are very hard workers and good citizens. And as the saying goes, some of my best friends are in the 1%.
As a result of various studies, activists like Occupy Wall Street and political leaders like Bernie Sanders, is the public now pretty much aware of the problem of income inequality?
The public is very much aware. And Democrats and some independents want government to do more to reduce it. But while most Republicans disapprove of inequality of income, and that should be emphasized, a majority of Republicans does not favor government actions. Occupy Wall Street did the country a service by calling attention to inequality. It was already gaining traction. President Obama has increasingly called attention to it and tried by executive order in small steps to create more fairness. Pope Francis has really been out front, and several international organizations have called attention to it. Francis's last encyclical in 2015, Laudato Si, was especially important in calling attention to climate change and inequality. And if I were to revise my book today, I would add that topic, the connection between climate change and inequality.
We're speaking with Ron Formisano, William Bryan Chair, Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Kentucky. His latest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. Ron, you argue that the problem we face is not just a disparity in wealth, but in social mobility and quality of life issues as well. What are some of the linkages there?
Before I answer that, going back to the last question about public awareness increasing, unfortunately, it doesn't matter to Congress. My book, Plutocracy in America, discusses a wide range of issues showing that public opinion doesn't matter to the Congress. And our founders, and I show this in my book, our founders really thought, so many statements by George Washington, James Madison, others, that public opinion would always act as an influence on the government. That's not happening. Okay, what about social mobility and quality of life? Most Americans still believe this is the land of Horatio Alger and opportunity. I'm sorry, Horatio Alger's dead. The reality is that multiple studies by demographers have shown that the United States has less social mobility and opportunity than most advanced countries. Cross-national comparisons have shown again and again the more inequality a country has, the less opportunity. As to quality of life, I explore these. I think this is where my book is different from some of the very excellent studies that have been done on inequality. People in poverty, the near poor, they increasingly live in areas segregated by income, race, ethnicity, a concentration of what Pope Francis calls social ills. Their life chances are less. Those lacking a high school degree will tend to have poor health, shorter life expectancy. They live in unhealthy places and lack access to healthy food, but they enjoy plenty of access to McDonald's and liquor stores and advertising inviting them to smoke and drink. The Center for Disease Control says that poverty has, quote, continuous effects on health that are cumulative over a lifetime. And the least well-off are least likely to engage in politics. And when they do go to vote, they are more likely to have much longer waits in line. They are more likely to be intimidated by challenges to their right to vote. and above all, a subject really for another question sometime, especially the working poor, are preyed upon by a host of predators trapping them in debt. Again, that might be that's a question. That's a subject for it's a subject for books, really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, is it just it's a development of a lack of trust towards the system? Is that also what happens in a case like this?
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a marvelous book by Wilkinson and Pickett called Spirit Level, and they have multiple correlations on a country level. The more inequality, the less trust of the citizenry and generally, but especially among low-income people. More mental illness, more drug and alcohol addiction, high infant mortality, and on and on. Yes, very much so, less trust.
And I guess this feeds into my next question, where you also contend that income inequality undermines democracy itself. Is this what we're talking about, or is there more to it than that?
Oh, the undermining of democracy or representative government is actually something Americans do recognize and are very well aware of, poll after poll. Large majority since 21 have said the Supreme Court 2010 Citizens United decision is bad for democracy and it should be overturned. Of course, that's had no impact. The latest Bloomberg Politics poll, 78% said it should be overturned. In other polls, 80% of Republicans have said it should be overturned. The rise of economic inequality has increased residential segregation by income, which I just mentioned, and heightened the tendency of low-income people not to vote, let alone engage in other forms of activity. Voting and political activity for decades has been highly correlated with income and education. And unlike other advanced democracies where non-voting is more evenly distributed across the socioeconomic ladder, it is concentrated here in the bottom of the population. The war on unions and their decline has had a similar effect, undermining democracy, along with the decline of civil organizations being replaced by elite professional groups that tend to concentrate on their particular issue rather than the general welfare. Why is that? Because unions organize people to vote. Civic organizations that are now replaced by these elite professional groups, they organize people to vote. You know, the bowling alone literature, the segmentation literature, all of that, along with inequality, has caused democracy to be undermined.
How much of an issue will this be in the presidential campaign? Is there any common cause to be made between a Bernie Sanders social democrat and a Donald Trump Republican?
Well, yeah, here's where I'm going to really get into it. Not enough will be made of inequality, I'm hoping. And there is no common ground between Sanders and the reality show fraud. Regarding Republicans, before the first debate in Cleveland, and I had hoped that they would talk about inequality, so did 70 religious leaders who sent letters before the debate in Cleveland to each presidential campaign following the Pope's lead and calling for climate change and inequality to be addressed, the two of the most urgent challenges of our time. The clergy called attention to 54% of Cleveland's children growing up in poverty, 54% of Cleveland's children growing up in poverty in 2013, and the city's high rate of infant mortality. And in Cleveland, everybody breathes the nation's 10th worst air quality, with a higher risk of shorter lives and damaged lungs. Of course, the candidates ignored Cleveland. In California, at the Reagan Library debate, they ignored inequality, even though earlier that day, the Census Bureau reported that median household income remained stagnant, having already declined, and the Bureau said the poverty rate hung at just under 15%. It's probably higher. But those 47 million people remained absent from the discussion. Wage stagnation since the 70s escaped notice. Oh, 3 candidates mentioned the middle class. Bravo. And also, of course, the middle class has been in decline for decades. Blaming President Obama was the default solution for restoring the middle class to health. Anyone watching the debate could be forgiven that thinking that California's ongoing extreme weather was taking place on another planet. Never mind that scientists believe weather disasters have been intensified by global warming, devastating California with a record-breaking 4-year drought, fueling those wildfires just up the coast from the Reagan Library. Most of the gaggle on that stage denies global warming, but figuratively, didn't anybody smell smoke or notice the flight of thousands of people and the destruction of hundreds of homes? Firefighters described those blazes as more intense and more destructive than any they'd ever seen. Now, ironically, a recent poll, this is a shocker, indicates that 56% of Republicans believe the climate is changing. Well, why is that? Well, how can people not miss these extreme weather events, floods, drought, once in a century storms every decade? The Republican deniers are really turning into Groucho Marx, who famously asked, "Who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?" And let's give a tip of the hat to the late, great Yogi Berra, who said you can observe a lot just by watching.
Right. Good old Yogi. Before we let you go, professors and pundits talk so much about income inequality these days, but how much inequality should there be? Is there a certain income level, a percentage of something that would define income equality?
Well, gosh, I did not realize that Pope Francis, President Obama, Janet Yellen, Federal Reserve Chair Christine Lagarde, Chief of the IMF, were professors and pundits, not to mention Oxfam and all those billionaires and world leaders who gather at the Davos Forum in Switzerland and who, believe it or not, identified inequality and climate change as the primary challenges of 2015. And none of those folks are talking about equality of outcome, but especially in the United States, the emphasis is always on equality of opportunity, which, as already noted, that's drastically diminished. The Social Progress Index ranks nations according to how well they meet the basic human needs of their population and improve the quality of their lives. Our government might adopt the goal of moving the United States up out of 16th place. And for starters, the United States could revise a way of defining people in poverty created in 1963, and that by an official who regarded that definition as temporary and insufficient. And here's a catch no one really talks about. The United States defines poverty in absolute terms, whereas European countries use relative poverty lines that measure distance from the median income and in relation to the standard of living in that country. So an expanded and more universal safety net with programs more like Social Security, and which Obamacare perhaps is heading toward, can reduce poverty and can promote economic growth. Have I got another minute on this one?
Absolutely.
Yeah, in relation to the who is poor is a moving target. There have been studies showing that as many as 40% of the American population at one time in their lives will be poverty-stricken or near poor. And many, many people who are counted as poverty within a year move out of it. So who is poor is a moving target. Of course, there are many that stay poor, and they stay poor for a long time. And in relation to this, to defining poverty in relative terms, in terms of the median income and the standard of living in that country, you have to go back to 1962, when even then conservatives were saying, well, the poor have refrigerators. And now they talk, the conservative think tanks talk about the hidden prosperity of the poor. Give me a break. Michael Harrington said it beautifully in 1962. He said, the poor in this country, they're not poor in India. They're not poor in the 16th century. They're poor here and now in the United States. And that's the way you have to look at this problem.
Absolutely.
Thanks for letting me add that.
Oh, absolutely. No, it's good stuff. Ron Formisano, William Bryan Chair, Professor Emeritus of American History at the University of Kentucky, joining us today to talk U.S. political culture and politics and his latest book, Plutocracy in America, How Increasing Inequality Destroys the Middle Class and Exploits the Poor. Professor, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Mitch McConnell, the sour old goose who heads the Senate Republican Caucus, had a hissy fit when the news leaked out that American women are about to have their most fundamental constitutional right taken from them by a cabal of Supreme Court judges. What made Mitch twitch, of course, was not the bad news for women, but the leak. He huffed that revealing the right-wing court scheme to the public was a stunning breach, spewing that it's an attack on the independence of the Supreme Court. Mitch, the so-called Supremes have been meeting behind closed doors specifically to plot an all-out attack on the independence of some 170 million women to control their own bodies. Why aren't you opposing the secrecy rather than supporting the court's subversion of women's liberty? Perversely, the entire Republican leadership is outraged by the leak rather than the attack on women. Right-wing blowhard Ted Cruz, for example, yapped that informing the public, quote, will do lasting damage to the integrity of the court. Ted, you and your ideological ilk annihilated the court's integrity and its legitimacy when you stacked it with a covey of corporate-coddling partisan hacks like Alito, Barrett, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Thomas. Then came Senator Mike Lee of Utah, a Trump acolyte, ludicrously blathering that the leak of the judicial plan is despicable. Why? Well, he explained to us commoners, the court, quote, is not a political body. If ignorance is bliss, Mike must be ecstatic. The GOP majority on this court is so immersed in its own partisan biases that it is routinely ruling against workers, the environment, women, voting rights, local communities, and democracy itself. This is Jim Hightower saying, no surprise then that the public trust in the integrity of these arbiters of justice is crashing. If the court won't respect our democratic ideals, the people won't respect the court.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Brian Levin, a criminal justice professor and the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino. Brian Levin, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. By the way, we are nonpartisan, and we'll talk to any community or research group that has questions, but we're nonpartisan and we don't endorse candidates, but we do support certain laws and policies.
And that's a good lead-in to our conversation today, Brian. We're now hearing numerous warnings of politically driven violence heading into the election. These reports are coming from within the government, and they often identify white supremacists as the greatest threat. Can you give us a sense of how this threat could actually play out? I mean, are we talking about largely armed militias?
It's a broad threat that is approaching our nation. And I think one of the things that we do is we often look at it through a political lens. And oftentimes that's not necessarily the worst place to start. However, there are also changes that are occurring non-ideologically with respect to extremism. So let me try and untangle this a bit. We've been saying for some time, and the words have been echoed by the FBI and DHS in subsequent reports and hearings, that the white supremacist / far right threat is the most prominent lethal threat facing the United States today. What I would say, though, it is not the only one. There are three types of people who engage in mass or symbolic violence. One are the ideologically motivated. Two are the psychologically dangerous. Three, personal benefit or revenge. And if you're thinking, hey, all three of them can be intertwined, you're absolutely right. So what we're seeing now, let me address it from the ideological perspective. We're seeing a prominence with regard to white supremacist far right. And last year, our data for 2019 showed that there were at least 29 white supremacist homicides in the United States, suspected white supremacist homicides in the United States. It's the third annual increase that the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism has found. And listen to this. Those 29 white supremacist far-right homicides were more than all extremist homicides by every ideological stripe done the year before. If you go back to 2016, we only had 3. And during that time, the alt-right and others were kind of dressing in their best khakis and going to demonstrations. So we saw a doubling in California, for instance, in that period of time of violent public demonstrations that ended at like third quarter 2017 over the previous 3 quarters the year before. So what I'm saying to you is activity on the fringes sometimes is more violent, sometimes more public, sometimes you can capture data by looking at certain terms online. But the bottom line is, I think in addition to the increases that we've seen in recent years, and I'll close up this particular question with this, has been that they have been jockeying into the mainstream. So sometimes groups can't make it in, but a certain type of coarseness, verbiage, conspiracism has. And I think that is critical here, because we have found in social media, as well as messages in the socio-political landscape, have created an elastic reservoir that has become a garden of conspiracism and fringe beliefs that then get in a fresh rush of new folks who can be radicalized, some of whom are fearful but not necessarily extremist at the time. So bottom line is, what we have now is the traditional increase in conflict and hate crime that we see around election times. Worst month for hate crime this decade for hate crime, November 2016 election month, last presidential election. Day after election was the worst day for 13 years. The second worst was October 2018, right before the House flipped from red to blue. And we saw in both these periods, by the way, terror attacks or plots. We saw a plot in 2016 to blow up a predominantly Muslim apartment complex in Kansas. And then in 2018, we saw a Tree of Life and some other attacks. By the way, this is something that happens other places as well. We saw an increase in hate crime in Britain around Brexit and the assassination of a member of parliament. So we have this kind of stuff that's been happening in recent years around elections. But now we have an overlay of a pandemic, people who are under stress, psychiatric stress, people who are under economic stress. Gun sales have gone up significantly. So we have kind of this perfect storm. And then on top of those contemporary anxieties and traditions of conflict around elections, we have this new civil guard, vigilantism, QAnon, and Boogaloo Boys. And with that, there's an interesting twist, along with accelerations, by the way, who are just looking for society to kind of burn down and they want to cause it. And that is a timing around election time as an event-driven period, along with a diversification of folks who are considered legitimate targets for aggression. Prior years, we saw Muslims, we saw Latinos, we saw Jews. We're still seeing that, by the way. But what we're also seeing is morph into a political hatred, so that, you know, Antifa, whatever that is, it seems to be conflated to everybody up to Joe Biden. And we're seeing public health officials, school officials. So we're seeing people who are engaged in both politics or some kind of public policy or public service being part of this new stereotyped and conspiracized set of enemies that are coming out in the hard right. And it's being fomented in many instances by this administration and some news media.
You know, you've been following hate groups and political extremists for a very long time, and I think you just answered my next question, which, you know, it's because there's the news cycle is just so rapid fire right now. It's kind of hard to figure out what's what, how much is has been there all along, or are we just recognizing it more? So we're seeing a real surge in this kind of activity, as opposed to perhaps just government acknowledging or the press covering it more.
You know, data can be your friend in both the hard and medical sciences, as well as the social sciences. And what I think is so remarkable is that when one looks at different data points, we're seeing confirmation. Let me give you another example, by the way. Hate crimes are actually down first half of the year 2018 in most places outside of Los Angeles. And most groups, other than anti-Asian, which has really gone up in many cities, including New York, San Francisco, San Jose, Los Angeles, and other places. So you kind of see this interesting parallel tracks that point in a particular direction. What I would say, though, is that, you know, when the Oklahoma City bomber took place, you know who we heard from again? The Unabomber. So what I'm saying to you is extremism doesn't occur in a hermetically sealed bag. It responds to advances by not only fellow travelers, but antagonists and certain kind of mutations that take place. And I think some of the biggest things that are not being covered, certainly the white supremacist is, but I think there are several tangential issues that have not been. The first has been, while centers like ours and others, but we've been very quick with getting the data out. You know, the lethal threat has increased for the last several years. You know, if that were air crashes or earthquakes, I think you'd see attention paid to it. So that's one thing. Also, how these groups organized. We were talking about 2016 when there was a brief quiescence, if you will, of the more lethal stuff. It's because they were on their best behavior while trying to enter the mainstream. Muslim bans, which were only before placed on the most extremist kind of groups like World Church the Creator or on Stormfront message boards, were now becoming quite popular in the mainstream. And what I think is important, and again, we don't endorse candidates, but it's really interesting. Anti-Muslim hate crimes, something like tripled, I think, around the San Bernardino terror attacks. 5 days later, when the Muslim ban proposal was trotted out in the morning on the internet, and then Twitter, and a campaign page, and then at a nationally televised conference that evening, we saw an immediate spike in the severity as well as the numbers of anti-Muslim hate crimes. Charlottesville, the big increase after Charlottesville was not the day after Charlottesville, but it was that Monday when the president made his very fine people statement. We saw hate crimes peak during that week at like 50% higher than the daily average. So there's this interesting interplay. And what we're concerned about is, as the new boogeyman is not like a person, or groups of people like Latinos and caravans, which helped motivate the Tree of Life attack because Jews were supposedly opening up the floodgates. But this messaging that we see, this data that shows up online, it gets repeated and it gets changed, whatever it is, and then it gets translated in some kind of aggression. Oftentimes, though, and I think the misconception is that a political leader, for instance, can really do this on their own. I think political leaders' rhetoric is most impactful when it comes around a highly charged event, terrorist attack, for instance, or even a pandemic. When President Trump briefly on March 23rd spoke tolerantly about Asian Americans and didn't use a national and ethnic-based term for COVID-19, we saw a brief pause in anti-Asian hate search. And we think the data is really preliminary. We're looking at day-by-day ticks as much as we can for anti-Asian hate crime. We think there might have been a brief pause there too, but then it went right back up again. So we're in a different environment now. And what's interesting about us is, unlike people who are looking out on the horizon and seeing clouds, we're actually kind of getting the meteorological data, and it doesn't look great. Just a couple last quick points. It also means that I think we're going to see a diversification with regard to extremism. A lot of people ask me, what about the left? One of the things that exists with regard to extremism is how big is that elastic pool of people that you can convert from the mainstream into your more violent cause. And I think today, particularly when we're looking at polls which indicate that the president is underperforming significantly, his supporters on the fringes, we've seen this at least in the past, may regard themselves being in a new, different type of milieu, more like an insurgency if the left and the Democrats come in. With regard to the hard left, the ability to make an insurgency has been most successful in the mainstream election campaign. In other words, people, for the most part, on the left, now there certainly are angry, and we're the most polarized that we've been in decades, and there certainly is fragmentation across all spectrums, including within ideological camps. The bottom line is, on the left, people are mobilized to vote. Mm-hmm. They're not mobilized so much to participate in a type of terrorism that is part of a hard right folklore. I'm not saying that people on the left aren't capable of committing extremist violence. We racked up our first hard left extremist homicide in years, maybe decades, just this year. But the bottom line is, extremism is diversifying, and we're concerned that the decline in trust in information and the communal institutions which hold us together, as well as the appearance of rapid change. While this is, the white supremacists and the far right in the pole position, it is one that in uncertain times can fragment.
I want to talk to you about, we witnessed bizarre, borderline scary moment during the first presidential debate, during which the president seemed to be encouraging the Proud Boys, a well-known hate group, with his words, stand back and stand by. First of all, tell us about the Proud Boys. And in one interview, in fact, you called them a sugar-coated version of skinheads.
They are of racist skinheads. And it's interesting because they're this platypus of a group. And I'll talk a little bit about them, but you know what? While there's a media scrum and researcher scrum around the Proud Boys, and certainly there should be because now they've been elevated. I think what is often, again, missed, and I'll get to the Proud Boys in just one second, is the history of violence, a folkloric type of leaderless resistance violence, one that often involves street gangs. Look, going back to the 1930s here in the United States, we had the silver shirts. Many people haven't heard of those. They were T-shirted street thugs who were the analog and cousins of Hitler's street thug brown shirts, kind of these brown shirts, these enforcers. So we have this tradition of this leaderless resistance, or these groups. We don't have that on the other side of the aisle as much. But what I think is interesting with respect to the Proud Boys is they've been able to angle themselves into this weird limbo zone of quasi-acceptability. They're neo-fascists, okay? They wear T-shirts of dissidents being thrown out of helicopters a la Pinochet, who they love, the 70s totalitarian dictator from South America. They loathe Muslims. They were founded in 2016 by the nitwit Gavin McInnes, who wrote that wonderful tolerant piece called 10 Things I Hate About Jews. So they're also anti-Semitic. They're misogynist. Another thing, boy, you could do a whole show, and there's some great people out there on the cutting edge of this research. Misogyny as kind of this glue, this machismo with these folks. So misogyny is big with the Proud Boys. They're xenophobic, and then they edge into the mainstream. How do they do it? Well, they say, hey, we have people of color in our group. Indeed, the current national leader is from South Florida, and he's Afro-Cuban. But they talk about Western chauvinism. This is along the spectrum, and in some places a wink and a nod code word for Euro-nationalism, white nationalism. So you can join our group as long as you think that, like, Euro folks are better. Yeah, and that's something that's been within the white supremacy world for some time. During the 80s, there was a fellow, I don't want to give his name, but there was a debate about, like, what about folks from Southern Europe who might have like Italian or Spanish type names? How do they show their cred in the white supremacist and white nationalist world? Bottom line is Proud Boys. And let me tell you something, I took pictures of these guys years ago. They were like so unimpressive. They looked like just weird. In other words, that's what struck me. When you go to a lot of these rallies and stuff, certain groups strike you a certain way. Certain groups try to promote the idea that they're non-aggressors and they're professional. And other, they just look like a ragtag bunch of Islamophobic, xenophobic fools. But they wear the Fred Perry shirts that the skinheads used to wear. I thought that was an interesting imaging. And what else? They were at Charlottesville, but they were also providing security for Roger Stone. And they'd show up at events where the hard left would be vigorously protesting. So bottom line is they've been involved with criminality, including just within the last week, where one has been charged in the Pacific Northwest on both coasts. Yes, they're ideological, but I would also say, and just bear with me, that they're also fraternal. And a lot of the chapters tend to mimic whatever the chapter leader kind of does. And they have, the weird thing about, punching new recruits until they can name, the cereals they like and stuff like that. So there's a fraternal misogynistic part of this, and some of the bigotry, the anti-Muslim, the xenophobia. Let me tell you something. It doesn't sound significantly different from what's been expressed by folks like Stephen Miller in the administration. So when you say, like, what about this group, the Proud Boys? The problem is, and I'll close up this question on this, but it's important. And by the way, we are nonpartisan, okay? But when President Bush spoke 6 days after 9/11 about tolerance towards Muslims, hate crimes against Muslims dropped precipitously the next day and into the next year. And what we've been seeing, whether it's around terror attacks or Charlottesville or elections, we're seeing these increases in both hate crimes, hate speech online, although it's variable, obviously, and these plots or attacks. And now we're entering a season where, elections are the boogeyman. In other words, before it was actual groups, violent Latinos in caravans and Muslims and things like that, which is so interesting because, today, they're the frontline workers in the health system. Anyway, we won't go there. But the bottom line is, and this is something we've seen with regard to hate crimes overall, they've been getting more violent. With regard to the terrorist attack overlays, 2019 is going to be the worst year for domestic terrorist violence that we've seen in some time. The DHS report, which kind of came out yesterday, you didn't see a lot of fanfare about it, did you? I was one of the people who was handing it out like popcorn at an open theater. And what it showed was their verbiage was almost exactly the same as our reports from last year, the year before, and the year before that. So when the president sends a message to the Proud Boys, stand down, he's acknowledging that, hey, I'm kind of your leader. And what the hard fringe movement did not have prior was someone who was a transmitter, a leader, and a coalescer in mainstream politics, who was telegenic and had access across all media. And whatever you want to say about the president, he's a master of using the theater of television and the internet and the news cycle to get his message out. And what he's been doing has been saying that the hard left has been the big threat. And we've been seeing that go through a Martinizing process, right? Or some kind of, processing into American political cheese food, right? That comes out that says the hard left threat is much greater than what we're saying, other analysts are saying, and indeed the agencies themselves, law enforcement and intelligence within the government, are saying as well. And so what we believe, and I'm sorry to have to do this, is we believe that there's been a corruption of the intelligence cycle for politics. And that is the stuff coming out of the law enforcement agencies and intelligence agencies is exactly in line with what we're seeing. But when we have certain agencies and agency heads saying things, and I am excluding the FBI director, who's been marvelous, it creates a social construction of a boogeyman threat that plays on fears, which may be very effective for getting up one's base, but it also sends a message to groups like the Proud Boys. But also, here's the thing. The Proud Boys are, I don't say the least of my worries, we're concerned about them, but we're concerned about another thing that we've been picking up, other analysts and government agencies have been picking up, and that is the decentralization of extremism, as well as the intertwining and idiosyncratic aspects. So you'll see more like Timothy McVeigh's than Grand Wizards from the Klan. And that's what we're worried about. When he sends this message out, this is a problem, because it might not just galvanize a base, and much of that base will know what to dismiss, right? They'll be like, yeah, these Antifa raccoons with grenades aren't coming to my door. Plane loads of Antifa aren't coming to my house. But I don't like the way change is occurring. And I think one of the things that we have to look at is there's a broad spectrum of people. A lot of these people are looking for purpose and meaning, and believe that the institutions that they grew up with have left them behind as society changes. But when that becomes radicalized in an echo chamber online, and then amplified by info wars or even by presidential tweets, it's a problem, because there's a sliver of people who are unstable or angry, who respond to these stereotypes and conspiracy theories in an aggressive way. Last thing, people formulate attitudes cognitively, their experiences, but also what they read, but also their emotions around them. And then lastly, their behaviors, which manifest the previous two. And what I'm saying to you is there's a spectrum of people on the right, and on the hard right, I'm not talking about conservative people of goodwill. Many of them will take this as just an ability to vent. And they also realize that the president, at the very least, engages in puffery, at the worst, downright falsehoods. But the problem is we can't sift through a grader and take out the dangerous people and the dangerous groups, some of which are informal, some of which are underground. And I think where we are now are yes, Proud Boys, Civil Guard, and that vigilantism. But we're also concerned about a variety of threads on that fringe where loners and small cells can take a ladle to this idiosyncratic 24/7 buffet of fringe conspiracies, stereotypes, and beliefs and formulate their own. But when you're having messages sent out to Proud Boys, and when you're having messages sent out about watch at elections, you are going to have people who are going to respond to that aggressively, either formally in some way, like a civil guard, but also informally from people who we don't know what their names are. They're stealth, they're underground, they're more violent, and they have a shorter half-life. Groups like the Base and Adamloffen Division, and even smaller associations.
We're speaking to Brian Levin, criminal justice professor and the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, a nonpartisan group at California State University, San Bernardino. Brian, in terms of how to fight back against this kind of hate, it's really hard to know where to begin. So let's start with our political leaders. What should we be hearing from them?
We should, and by the way, thank you so much for asking this. And again, we're nonpartisan, but we've seen it. Look at John McCain's speech, his concession speech on the evening that Barack Obama was elected. Look at President Reagan, who launched his campaign, by the way, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, when the Klan endorsed him, and without delay dismissed that support, root and branch. We need political leaders, celebrities, and those who have access to a wide pipeline of coverage to talk in a conciliatory manner and say, we can disagree. We don't have that, and it's being rewarded. So that's one thing. Political and cultural leaders set a tone that is picked up by many, whether it's wearing masks or other things. And when we have a president who is retweeting white genocide TM tweets, which say that blacks are responsible for the overwhelming majority of white homicides, that's not helpful. Neither is retweeting Klan type black crime visuals showing whites being beaten by blacks. It's elemental. What else do we have to do? Social media companies have to have standards and start enforcing them. And where I think a mistake is being made, Facebook just took down QAnon. And let me tell you, research has shown, we've seen that out of some universities in Canada, for instance, deplatforming extremists off commercial sites, the big ones, actually does have an effect. And we've seen this year, the Liberate movement translate into something different, not only a place where people could have both legitimate and sometimes crazy grievances regarding lockdowns, it also became a gathering place and a reservoir for a variety of folks who then went off on their own and radicalized new people. So these large companies are acting, they are doing things. I'm going to say they're not, but after all the horses left the stable, QAnon's huge. We have about 24 congressional candidates this year with QAnon. So social media companies, what else? I think that we want to reward those news media outlets, those interviewers who are effective at promoting civil critical analysis as you're doing today. It's a cultural thing too. And I think, though, we have to be responsive to people on different ends of the political spectrum who see a changing society and say, you know what? There are values that we all can agree on. Civil discourse, proper elections where everyone can vote, the right to freedom of speech, and the right to peaceful associations in public. Let's start there. But unfortunately, the currency that's given to people is not to folks like Brian and Jim, but for the Anns and InfoWars of the world.
Mm-hmm. How do you feel about law enforcement? Should law enforcement be more active in uncovering and disrupting hate groups?
Yes, to the extent that it does not violate First Amendment protections. I'm extremely worried right now when we're seeing federal law enforcement being used for improper purposes, both to stop legitimate peaceful protests, but also where we've seen certain law enforcement agencies, I'm leaving out FBI, have their leaders taking political positions with regard to national security threats. So yes, look, we have to go wherever the most violent threats are. And, whether it's the Jewish Defense League, whether it's the Weather Underground from decades past, or whether it's violent Salafist jihadists from overseas, whether it's hard leftists, whether it's an idiosyncratic mix. But I'll tell you, the biggest threat right now, and I'll tell you something else. I'd love to see the people who years ago were patting me on the back saying, attaboy, when we said, the violent Salafist jihadist threat due to the command of both geography and the internet of some of these groups was having an effect here in the United States. It was used by every xenophobe and Islamophobe as an excuse to defame good Muslim Americans here in the United States. But today, when it's white supremacy, the president says, no, I don't think, when I wrote my piece in Time, I quoted him. He said, no, I don't, it's just a few people, nothing to worry about. So I think law enforcement has to go with where the threat is. We are going to try here in California to start a commission on the state of hate. We have some wonderful assembly people helping us there. But what's happened is the federal government has abrogated its responsibilities, not only with regard to the rhetoric. Hate crime prosecutions were down 38% when I went to the Justice Department last fall, over the last couple of years before that. So what we have to do is make sure that we protect civil liberties, but that we also have an approach that looks at criminality and not politics. And if there's a violent or criminal threat, that should determine where we put our resources, our legislation, and our policies. And I'm concerned in this environment when the quote Antifa threat is being so blown out of proportion as to be a lie. And by the way, can I call somebody out on it? Lara Logan from Fox Nation. She falsely says that the shooting in Ohio last August, was Antifa, when the FBI specifically this summer again came out with a statement saying that there were a multitude of variables with his motivation and that he was a violent problem going back, is what the investigators have been saying as well. So there's been this construction of a threat, and she is unfortunately aiding and abetting that falsehood with respect to Ohio. Bottom line, though, we're seeing a diversification with regard to extremism, and what we need are leaders who will say, even to the folks they disagree with, you should be heard as well. Remember, a lot of people join these movements for personal idiosyncratic reasons. There's peer validation. It feels culturally comfortable at a time of change where no one is saying that I'm important, my safety is important, and my narrative is important. And one of the things I think, frankly, that universities and even our friends who are progressives is say, you know what, maybe we should dialogue more with people of goodwill across the aisle. That's going to be difficult. I wouldn't bet money on that horse coming in first, but I think it's something that we could use. And if you listen to the language, for instance, of President Obama, President Kennedy, even President Bush, and John McCain, there's that tradition that we have to appeal to our better angels. And one of the things that I love about my friends who are progressives is they do like to talk and they like to convince. And I think there is a narrative there from which to build across the aisle, particularly at this time of change. What I'm worried about is an insurgency of those who think they're left out, particularly on the hard right, but not exclusively, who are going to view if the president loses or if some conservative candidates lose, look at that as something where now they have to take arms. This is the kind of violent rhetoric we are seeing on the internet now. So what I'm saying to you is mainstream politics has an effect on extremists. Can they galvanize? Are they part of an insurgency? Is there a shiny object that people can unite on that side of the spectrum? An enemy, it might be Joe Biden, for instance. That's going to be a problem. And that's going to take us even after the election. So my caution now is, unlike past elections where we saw violence kind of be seasonal, sometimes if it looked like, for instance, President Obama was going to get the nomination for both his party and the presidency, hate crimes went up in anticipation. And indeed, he got his Secret Service protection the earliest of any major candidate. So what I'm worried about, though, is the seasonality predictability is going to be changed, and we're going to see something a bit more sustained, because that ecosystem on the hard right fringes is still going to be there. And that's what we worry about, particularly with these folks who want to commit mass killings. We're certainly looking at the civil guard types, the vigilante type, the people who show up to ram cars or shoot at protests. But we're also concerned about this template of young people who leave manifestos and they do it around change. And we have a big possible change coming up. So that's what we look at in the kind of non-ideological way that we run risk assessment.
Brian Levin, criminal justice professor and the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism, a nonpartisan group at California State University, San Bernardino, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Brian, we appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. And irrespective of what your ideology or party is, please vote.
Absolutely. Excellent advice. Thank you again. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Congressman, what's your assessment of the impact of that decision, assuming it sticks, both on American women, but also on American politics?
You know, a lot of things, right? I mean, first of all, I shouldn't say no one, let me rephrase that. A lot of people didn't think this was ever going to happen. This is settled law, half a century. People who've gone before the Senate to be nominated and proved as Supreme Court justices have basically said, no, this will never happen. And yet we know that this has been the plan for decades. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised it's happening, other than that people denied it when they were getting nominated and appointed. And, this is extremely unfortunate in the sense that this is going to set back a half a century of law saying that women can't make their own decisions about their healthcare and their bodies. And in reading the leaked draft, they also showed some slippery slope other areas they may go to. I mean, the very next morning, I got calls from people saying, hey, marriage equality, is my marriage still going to be recognized? Well, maybe not if you read the memo. And that's the problem, is now it looks like the court is going to be a very activist court from a very extremist kind of perspective. And, this should be a wake-up call for everyone that if it turns out this is their decision and the way they go, elections truly, truly have consequences, and appointments have consequences, and people just have to be very ready to act.
By the way, you and I remember when Republicans used to accuse Democrats of appointing activist judges, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they're great at doing things like, saying exactly what they're doing, attacking that and saying we're doing it. They go after people often and attack their strengths in order to make them weaknesses. I mean, they're not afraid to hold anything back. And I think, Democrats, sometimes we may be a bit too genteel in how we respond with things. But, the Republicans have never been ashamed of they're there to get something done. And that in this case, it's a very extremist agenda. But that's what the modern Republican Party is.
Do you believe that this will serve as a wake-up call to Democrats, to independents, even pro-choice Republicans, that these midterms really matter and could make a difference?
I do. And all elections matter, right? And this is what it should send to many folks, because, again, I think thinking people thought this would never happen based on the actual statements of Supreme Court nominees. And now we see that, this is the real agenda that's been out there to overturn 50 years of law just for political extremism means the only way people can be heard is to get rid of people who appoint these types of folks, who vote for confirm these types of folks. And I think it will be a wake-up call. And don't forget, it's taking away freedoms, right? Again, Republicans are great about talking about freedoms, yet they're the ones actually taking them away. And this is the freedom to make decisions about your own bodies and healthcare. And if they start going after things like marriage equality, the decisions to, about who you love, and go down the list, I think there's a lot more that will also be attacked in the very near future if this goes through.
So I find it somewhat amusing, Congressman, that rather than taking a victory lap, right, as you said, this is something Republicans have been working for actively, promising for over 50 years, right? But rather than taking a victory lap and crowing about it and popping the champagne cork, they're kind of trying to run away from this decision now, right? I mean,
Laura Ingraham, right? She's like, "Oh, this is terrible timing." Well, why does the timing matter if this was something you desperately want to get done? Oh, because you want to continue to hoodwink and lie to people. Now I understand why you may not be out there talking about it, and why aren't people like Donald Trump more aggressively talking about what he's accomplished through his court appointments. There's a reason. They know this is wildly unpopular. I think the best poll I've seen for their stance is at about a third of Americans, and in most, it's the more extremist parts of this are like in the double digits in the teens. If you ask someone, if you thought someone who's been raped or had to for rape or incest, should you be able to make sure that you don't bring a baby into this world, and that polls very, very, very low, and yet this very extreme position will likely impact people in all sorts of cases and leave it to the states.
So the question is, I think that some of us are asking is, while Republicans try to run away from it, will Democrats make sure they can't run away from it? Will Democrats use this as an issue to say, look, this is one issue you've got to get out there and vote in these midterms on this issue, on abortion? Are Democrats prepared to do that?
We better. I mean, I think the Senate this week is going to do what the House already passed, which is codifying Roe versus Wade into law, right? I mean, it's important that, we do that. The problem is with a 50-50 Senate and a 3 or 4 seat margin, depending on the time of this session we've had in the House, it's been really tricky to get some things done. But, if the people who sometimes are afraid of their constituents on this one, then, we're all going to wind up paying a really severe price for this. So I hope, this is a core issue, I think, as a Democrat, the freedom to make decisions about your own healthcare and your own body and decisions about who you love. I mean, if we're going to be afraid to stand up for those sorts of things, then, we will pay a price for that.
So, Congressman, I want to circle back to something we talked a little bit about, and that is this leaked opinion by Justice Samuel Alito. In his writing, he says that one of the reasons for overturning Roe v. Wade is because way back in 1787, our founding fathers didn't talk about abortion. It's not an enumerated right in the Constitution.
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, he's going to the law from the 1600s. This is crazy stuff, right? That what we read in this opinion. I thought Saturday Night Live did a great job with their opening skit on Saturday night, showing the absurdity of much of the argument in a modern world. But on top of that, the fact that they mentioned things like marriage equality,
yep,
that's very real. And I think, people are very concerned. There have been a lot of protests and rallies, clearly already in my district and across the country. This is something that, people see as an extremist position, but that's what the Republican Party is. It's just, they never want to tell you that. But if you see that slippery slope in other areas, it's you got to wonder when you're going to lose your freedoms in order to appeal to extremists in the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party, used to be just made up of greedy people and politically extreme on the conservative social spectrum. Now it's even gotten worse under Donald Trump, and yet the real ramifications are a lot of erosions of rights for a lot of different people.
So, Congressman, the last time we talked, we spoke about the Build Back Better initiative and legislation, that package in Congress. Is there anything left of Build Back Better? Is it just gone?
So what the Progressive Caucus and some of the other caucuses are doing right now are encouraging the president to do executive orders, because with a 50-50 Senate, with a few of the senators, Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, and maybe others on certain issues, it's almost impossible to get anything done. And as much as there are great things in that Build Back Better agenda that would be wildly popular, as you know, in Washington, there's also a ton of special interests, and there's a lot of people who I think all too often are almost afraid of their own constituents. And because of that, you're going to see it's been difficult to finish the rest of the Build Back Better agenda. Don't forget, infrastructure was a part of that agenda. So there's another way to do that, and I think many of those items can happen through executive orders. Not all can, but many can. And while they're not as permanent as being in statute, it's certainly a way to show how they can work. And then we can have, I think, a better chance to get them done so that they'll be in law and permanently in place for people. So, we think it's important the president start acting now. I don't think any more time has to be wasted. We should be doing these several a week and showing people what will actually get done, in addition to stopping the craziness of what we saw last week on Roe versus Wade. But what you'll also see is the continuation of the benefit from electing Democrats. We passed the American Rescue Plan last year. We passed the infrastructure bill. This year, we've passed the Competes Act, which will be soon passed through the House and Senate and signed by the president, about computer chips and trying to bring down costs and make more things here in America. We passed a postal reform bill that almost got no notice, and yet we've talked about it for a decade, that fixes this craziness of having to prepay employee benefits 75 years into the future that made the post office financially insecure. And we also protected 6-day mail delivery for people, which I'll tell you, organically, it's probably in the top 3 issues I hear from constituents. They're concerned about postal issues, right? And we did that. So we've done a lot of good things. The problem is there's a COVID hangover. Inflation has taken people away from many listening to maybe some of the other things we've done. But if you could start getting executive orders out there and get those done, again, you're showing what we can do. If you let us pick up Wisconsin and Pennsylvania in the Senate, and you let us pick up some additional seats in the House, how we can get those things done.
Give us a couple of examples of executive orders that, first, let me ask, are you working with the White House on these executive orders? Are they open to this?
Yes, they are open to this. So a couple of weeks back, I think 13 of the caucuses went in and met with the White House. And I know it wasn't just ours. I think it was the Hispanic Caucus and others as well came in with a list of things that they would like to see done via executive order, just looking at the reality of a 50-50 Senate. And given that,
Give us a couple of examples of things that you'd like.
Eliminating student debt. There have been a variety of, I guess, the amount of the proposals. The president had previously talked about 10,000. We would like to see more, but you know what? Let's relieve some student debt so that people can get going with their lives, because those jobs are going to help us to, get the economy going, and they have been. Also, things like worker protections, and some of the laws that we have around overtime. There was a law that was done via executive order under President Obama. It got turned over under the Trump administration on overtime pay. And we think there's a place that they can go back to that won't get overturned, that could protect people. Because right now, I think the level is if you make $33,000, that's enough that you don't get any overtimes. Well, $33,000 isn't all that much, right, for someone working full time, especially if that overtime isn't paid for, and then you're working 60 hours a week for that or more. So there's worker protections, there's environmental issues that we can do. There's a whole lot of things, and we've proposed a number of them as a progressive caucus, but other caucuses have as well. And I'm hoping that the president will start doing those pretty quickly, because I think it's time for people to find out. I think they're tired of watching things not happen, and trying to explain a 50-50 Senate is a longer conversation than you can really do to let people know that you're getting things done. And that's why we need to move on these as fast as possible.
Especially when you can't even count on all 50 Democratic votes, right?
Well, exactly, and that's, I think, the very obvious problem. So
how do you think? How does the Progressive you, as a former co-chair of the Progressive Caucus, your fellow progressives, how do you feel so far about Joe Biden and how he has responded to the progressive agenda, if you will?
I mean, I've been very impressed on multiple levels. I went to 4 states for Bernie Sanders, and was very happy to do that. And but I'll tell you, the Joe Biden administration has been amazing in reaching out to members, reaching out to the Progressive Caucus on a very regular basis. I would argue our caucus had the president's back on Build Back Better more than anyone, because we appreciated the values that he was putting out there and trying to get done. I think there's always areas we'd like to see some additional measures or improvement, but the amount of outreach has been exceptional, and I really feel like they listen and are trying to get things done.
Do you think some progressives have been a little too hard on Biden, too tough on Biden? I mean, I've heard just over the weekend, there were progressives chanting, "Where's Joe?" on the in front of the Supreme Court, right? Progressives complaining that Biden hasn't done enough about climate change or whatever. Do you think some of your fellow progressives maybe are a little too strong here?
By and large, my position is shared by, I think, most progressives. I'm just saying that anecdotally, but the amount of access has been exceptional. I mean, Build Back Better, the agenda around daycare and the child tax credit, and so many issues around climate and others we've strongly supported. So, it's not his fault those things didn't happen. It's a few folks over in the Senate's fault why they didn't happen. And, you can't fault the person who actually came up with the idea to do those. So, I think there's always people who like to complain, but sometimes may not actually follow politics as closely as they should. I saw that this morning alone. There was a situation where there was a damage done, supposedly a Molotov cocktail thrown inside a very conservative place in my district that advocates against personal choice around abortion, against equality for the LGBTQ plus community. And, I already saw tweets this morning saying, "Oh, there was a Molotov cocktail at an abortion clinic in Madison." No, actually, not at all. But people sometimes take stuff and maybe don't have all the facts. I think in the case of Joe Biden, the facts are he has led in many areas more progressive than I have seen a Democrat in the White House probably in my adult lifetime. And I'm going to try to acknowledge those things and push for more where we want to push for more.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.